This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey horror fans, I'm the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary on a serial killer. And this is one I've been meaning to do for quite a while. And yes, I'm going to wear these throughout the entirety of the review. You can probably guess who it is by now. This is a documentary that I've seen before. Some people call it a film. It's a documentary. There are a lot of dramatizations throughout it, but it's a documentary. It came out in 2012, but I remember seeing it for the first time. I think it was on Netflix in 2013. Then I saw it again. I think it was for free on YouTube for a while, but I was able to find it at the store that I go to. It's put out by IFC, which if you follow my channel, you know right after A24, IFC is my second favorite movie company, especially for modern films. And this is on a killer that has had countless things made on him. In fact, I even pulled everything I own just to prove the point, and that barely even touches everything that's put out there on this guy. But it is the Jeffrey Dahmer files, which I've always thought this was a very good documentary. Now, first, just to show how much there is of him, like just so I can make my point as to why I think this is good. Now, just as far as movies go, there's My Friend Dahmer. There's the first film, Secret Life, Jeffrey Dahmer, which came out in '93. There's the Jeremy Renner film, and then I was able to find a bootleg of the Netflix Dahmer. And then, as far as books go, I mean, first off, he's every encyclopedia of serial killers. He's on the cover about half of them, but he's in every single one. I have about 30 of these books, like encyclopedic books. He's in all of them. He's one of the most notorious serial killers in history. But then based on him specifically, you know, there's the Jeffrey Dahmer story, Inside the Mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, Monster. I mean, there's also the book, the graphic novel version of My Friend Dahmer. There is the comic book from the 90s, which is really expensive online. Lionel Dahmer's book. And then as far as like documentaries go, every program of serial killers, you know, whether it be Portraits of Evil, Becoming Evil, Notorious Killers, Most Evil Serial Killers, A&E Biography, they're going to have an episode on Dahmer. In fact, you know, there's also this NBC DVD, which has Dahmer and Berkowitz. I thought this was going to have the whole Stone Phillips interview. It doesn't. So the reason why I show all that is because other than programs, you know, like this, where there's episodes of a bunch of different killers, A&E, biography, stuff like that, when there's a film documentary or like a special on Dahmer, a guy who's had countless things made on him, I wonder what's going to make this one stand out? What's going to make this one different? Or what's going to make this one worth making or worth watching? I will say the best one is still probably the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes. I do own the DVD of the Bundy tapes. I had to find a bootleg of Dahmer if there is one. I would say that's the best one. But this is one that does do something different. And the information it gives, the way it's presented, this does do something different than the typical sort of textbook to documentary life, crimes, death of a serial killer. This one is very specific. In its 76-minute runtime, it all focuses on the initial arrival of police on July 22nd, 1991 to apartment room 213 at the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, all the way up to his death. And, you know, there's no voiceover narration. There's very limited talking head interviews. In fact, there's only 3. There's the medical examiner, Jeffrey Jensen, the interrogation detective, Pat Kennedy, and Dahmer's neighbor, Pamela Bass. which is half of the Cleveland character in the Netflix Dahmer series, because Glenda Cleveland lived in an adjacent building. She's the one that made the inquiring calls about Conrad phone. She wasn't there when it happened, but she did make the phone calls. Pamela Bass is the one that lived next door to him, had to deal with the smells, the noises, did eat a sandwich given to her by Jeff, which she does talk about in this. It seems more cordial in this than as it was portrayed more sinister in the Netflix show, but she does address it. And there is a little bit of voiceover towards the end of some professor, I think, but we don't see him. But that's it. So it's very intimate, it's very focused, just focusing on the arrest and surrounding events leading into the trial, and then just where those three people went, sort of the aftermath, the impact it had on their life, and the impact on Milwaukee. So no, there's no talk about, born in Bath, Ohio, where he went to high school, serving in the military, being arrested for various indecent exposure charges throughout the 80s, living with grandma. No, it literally starts with, Jensen, Kennedy, and Bass sort of talking about where they were, like that day, before everything happened, and then really just going through all the events. Pamela Bass hearing, police stuff going on, and then hearing all kinds of stuff. Pat Kennedy arriving, being told to look in the fridge. Jensen, when he arrived, and things he had to look for, and things he found. So, the fact is just those three people. I mean, there's no interviews with, criminologists who have studied or written about Dahmer. It's just a very intimate, very narrowly focused, first-hand account of three people that were there. And to me, that's a documentary worth making and worth seeing. Because it's not just another, opening up with, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. He was born Bath, Ohio, May 21st, 1960. Working all the way up to his death, November 28th of 94. It really just focuses on this. And yes, there are dramatizations. You do get this guy playing Dahmer, who, I don't know if it will say his name, but I'm guessing it's Andrew Swant. Is he the one that plays Dahmer? I'm guessing, because he's the only one that I don't recognize under the names. And it really just shows him, it doesn't show him committing of any murders. It hints towards some, like it hints towards the murder of Stephen Tuomi on September 15th, 1987, who was his second victim. Checking into the Ambassador Hotel, then the next day having to go out by a suitcase. There's a very long shot when he goes in with the suitcase, the hallway, and then when he comes back out with the suitcase. So it hits towards stuff like that, but it usually just shows him doing mundane things. Shopping for goldfish. In fact, it even opens, well, actually it's a piranha tank, but, shopping for fish at the pet store, going to look at trash cans at the hardware store, walking around, drinking, eating fast food, riding the bus, buying his 57-gallon blue plastic drum. It does show the how he stole the mannequin. Some of the dramatizations are a little incorrect. Now, I don't know if that's by design or if they just got some of the things wrong. Like when it shows Dahmer having security guys come over for install security, we see the apartment is 214. When he steals the mannequin, he tells the taxi guy to go to the Oxford Apartments. He was living with grandma when he stole the mannequin. The guy he checks into the Ambassador Hotel with is African American. Stephen Tuomi was white. But then it shows him at the Pride Parade meeting another victim, taking him on the bus. That was Matt Turner on June 30th of 91. He was African American, but this guy is white. So it gets some stuff wrong. in the dramatization, but I'm guessing that's by by choice, maybe to make it look like a dramatization. But also, we don't see Dahmer other than a couple. You have the news anchors that like the picture up here. A couple instances of those because there's a ton of news footage throughout this, but we don't actually see Dahmer until probably about an hour in, and it's footage of I think it was his first trial when he walks in with a striped shirt, which we get to find out through Pat Kennedy where those clothes came from. That's the first time we actually see Dahmer in like a video footage type way. Well, no, there is some home video footage, like when Dahmer was visiting Lionel, his legs across, reading the paper, talking about fast food. It does have that in the beginning, but what that does is because everyone's talking about Jeff, we see this actor playing him in the dramatizations, and of course talking about all the horrific things that were found in the apartment. It creates this sort of uh, aura of mystique, or sort of this uh, of ominous kind of atmosphere that we don't finally get to see the guy until he enters the courtroom for the first time. In fact, just prior, it shows news footage where the anchor is saying like, "This here is his 1982 mugshot when he was arrested. We're eager to see how his appearance has changed in 10 years." And then that's when we get the footage of Dahmer entering the courtroom. And then that's really the first time we get to see Dahmer himself throughout the whole documentary. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, it does kind of create this sort of. It almost makes him come off as like a mystical figure, which obviously he's not. But just the way everyone's talking about him, but we only see him through like dramatization, it does kind of create this enigmatic feeling. But again, I do appreciate that this is not just your typical sort of life story kind of documentary. It's about a very specific aspect, the arrest, the investigation, and the trial. Mainly the arrest and everything they found and went through at the apartment, and only told by the people that were involved. So again, it's very narrowly focused, it's very sharply focused, it's very intimate just because of who's in it, who's speaking. You don't really have any outside voices giving an opinion, just the people that were there. And so it does make me say that, yeah, of all the things that have been made by Dahmer, and of course, every 3 to 4 years, there seems to be some sort of resurgence in either popularity or interest, and we get a new thing that comes out. Like this came out in 2012, then 2017 we get My Friend Dahmer, then in 2022 we get Netflix and the Dahmer tapes. So every 4 or 5 years there's a new thing. And I'm sure most people are thinking, do we really, like, what's going to make this one different? What's going to make this one stand out? And this one I think does a good job at that. This is not your typical documentary. And yeah, it has it is very focused, very intimate, which is very good for a documentary. And I think all three of the people involved really tells their story well. I didn't even say who directed it or anything, which it was directed by Chris James Thompson, who also wrote it along with Andrew Swan. I think the guy that plays Dahmer. I just want to make sure before, yeah, actor, writer. So yeah, it tells the story well. It has a lot of news footage, a lot of archive footage to go along with it. Doesn't really have any of the grisly stuff, obviously. Like, it doesn't show any photos of like the skulls or the fridge or any of that. But there are a lot of photos of his apartment. And, of course, all the archive footage of like the hazmat guys taking the vats out through the fire escape. Pamela Bass, really talking about, her relationship as a neighbor with Jeff, the aftermath of that. They do get into sort of the backlash of the police following his arrest and just what came out about the police. Uh, Actually, Pat Kennedy talks about his relationship as the interrogating officer, is sort of what came of that. And then it pretty much just ends with them talking about, where they were when they found out Jeff was killed. And then it just ends with text saying what they went on to do since his death. So it's very well made. Um, I would say the guy does an okay job at playing. I mean, it's not like he's given a lot to do. He mostly just walks around. But yeah, you can tell there's something off about him. He is kind of creepy. Uh, he looks and acts way better than the guy in Raising Jeffrey Dahmer, which is one film I don't have. But yeah, of all the Dahmer things that have ever come out, especially documentary-wise, even aside from just like programs like this or A&E, where there's just another episode of him, just whole documentaries just dedicated to him, I would say this is definitely one to check out. Now, obviously, you're going to get more information. It is not going to be as comprehensive as, say, the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes. But actually, maybe this has as much, if not more, about the arrest, the trial, how they were able to ID the bodies, and what was found in his apartment. As much or more than in the Dahmer tapes. I've only seen that once. But yeah, definitely one to check out, especially if you're into the Dahmer story at all. Definitely check this out. Definitely worth it. It's certainly one that will stand out against just the masses of tons of documentaries on him because it chooses to be different, and I highly appreciate that. So with that, I guess we'll get to the quick summary and then just a vague list of topics that this film covers. So as always, I like to give a brief summary on the killer that the film was based on. So Jeffrey Dahmer, aka the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, is one of America's most notorious and infamous serial killers ever. Between June 1978 and July 19, 1991, before his highly televised arrest on July 22, 1991, Dahmer killed 17 young men and teenage boys, with 16 of them being between September 30th of 87 and July 19th of 91. His first, a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, was committed the summer he graduated high school in 1978. Dahmer was born May 21st, 1960 in Bath, Ohio, and after serving in the military from 1979 to 81, being deemed unsuitable for military due to his drinking, he lived with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, between December of 81 and May 14, 1990, which is where 4 of his murders occurred. He then moved to the Oxford Apartments, room 213, and stayed there until his arrest, committing 12 more murders. As a young child, he would collect, dissect, and dissolve roadkill and animals he found, being shown how by his chemist father Lionel, which is an activity that would carry over to his crimes, where he would dismember, dissect, and attempt to dissolve and eventually cannibalize his victims. 5 skulls and 7 skeletons would be found in his apartment, along with other assorted body parts and organs. A lifelong loner and feeling conflicted in his homosexuality, he attempted to make living zombies by drilling into his victims' heads and pouring acid or hot water into their brains while they were still alive, to attempt to make them more submissive, though this never worked. He was also a lifelong alcoholic ever since high school, which led to issues in the military and several jobs afterwards, until the Ambrosia chocolate factory, which he was fired from in the weeks before his arrest. He was finally caught when his to-be 18th victim, Tracy Edwards, escaped from his apartment and flagged down police and brought them back to his apartment in the early hours of July 22nd, 1991. Prior to his second murder, which he always claimed not to remember due to blacking out, and was 9 years after his first, he was blacklisted from gay bars and bathhouses for drugging and assaulting men. He also had a history of sexual crimes involving indecent exposure throughout the 1980s. The negligence of the police involving the murder of 14-year-old Conrad Synthesiphone led to the outrage of homophobia and racism in the Milwaukee area after his arrest. He was convicted of the 16 of the 17 murders and sentenced to 941 years in prison. On November 28, 1994, he was murdered in the prison gym by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, who also killed another inmate, Jesse Anderson. Countless books, movies, documentaries, and comic books have been made on and about Dahmer ever since his death. And his possessions have become some of the most expensive, quote, murderabilia. And so I know that was a little bit longer than some of the other summaries that I've done, but there's just a lot about him. And I will say Dahmer is probably, for as long as I've studied serial killers, he's one of the three I'm probably the most well-versed in. So we get the opening credits, it shows fish tanks, dramatization of actor Dahmer, buying fish. We get interviews with the medical examiner, Jeffrey Jensen, the interrogating officer, Detective Pat Kennedy. They're sort of summing up the nature of their jobs. And then we get dramatization of Jeff walking into a hardware store, looking at aluminum trash cans, them not being right. Then we get the opening interview with Pamela Bass, Dahmer's Oxford Apartments neighbor. Her kind of talking about the area of Milwaukee, how, it was sort of the more ghetto-y areas, it was more of the drug areas, how she met Jeff, him taking garbage out, and how they struck up a conversation. We get the home video of the Dahmers with Jeff talking about fast food, and that's the only time we see video footage of Dahmer until much, much later, which again sort of creates that enigmatic feeling of hearing about him and all this horrific stuff, but not quite seeing him. Then dramatization of Dahmer having the security guys over to install security cameras, which, yes, it is said that he had some kind of video camera in his apartment. And again, it says 214, not 213. Pamela talks about how she used to visit with Jeff and each other going over to each other's apartments for dinner and whatnot. Pat Kennedy talks about, his initial arrival to the apartments and, talks about the initial smell, the smell of death. Pamela talked about what she was doing when the police, first arrested him and how she could hear it while she was in bed. We get the dramatization of Jeff stealing the mannequin, which again, he tells the cab driver, Oxford Apartments, when he was living in West Allis with Grandma Dahmer at the time he stole the mannequin. Pat being told, he's the interrogating officer. Don't let anyone else talk to him. Only you talk to him. Which is something I noticed on rewatching this, is something that one of the few inaccuracies that this had, which it shows two officers talking to Dahmer during his interrogation. But still, this is like one of the most accurate things that I've ever seen. So, so then Pamela just talking about the just the chaos and the pandemonium that was going on in the building with the tenants and the police. It shows actor Jeff drinking at a carnival just outside of it. And there's some sort of parallel with the dramatization, sort of with what they're talking about. I think Pamela just talked about how much of a loner, how he kept to himself. Then we get like a dramatization of him drinking alone just outside the carnival. Pat, when he first brought Jeff to the interrogation, how they first started talking to each other, his first impressions of Jeff. Dramatization of Jeff buying his 57-gallon blue drum. Jeffrey Jensen, the medical examiner, goes over in detail all the different things that were found in the apartment. what was in what box, or what was in what closet or the freezer, or what was in the barrel. You know, he goes over pretty explicitly what was in all of that. Uh, Dramatization of Jeff checking into the Ambassador Hotel with a black male companion. This is obviously a dramatization of when he brought Stephen Tuomi on September 15th of 87, but he was white. Uh, News footage of when it initially broke out. Jensen talking about having to remove the bodies from the barrel. He even talks about, you know, the famous footage of the two guys in yellow hazmat getup taking the vats and freezers down the fire escape. You know, he talks about those two guys, how they were like young 20-something guys who he thought might not be able to handle it. Uh, that long scene of Jeff going in, when we see him buying the suitcase, going back in the room to smuggle the body out. We don't see it. We just see him go in, long shot of the hallway, then walk out with the suitcase, which that is true. He had to smuggle Stephen Tuomi's body out in a suitcase that he had to go buy. And then Pat talking about how they're able to identify all 17 victims, even the ones where he didn't save anything, how he said it was like a 6-week process, and the kind of meticulous nature of how they were able to do all that. Pamela talking about her personal aftermath and her drinking, you know, talking about how people always coming up to her and either blaming her as part of the problem for not doing anything, or people willing to offer her money just to sit on the couch that Jeff gave her. News footage of some of the racial protests and movements. Dramatization of Jeff at a pride parade, meeting a young white man, then taking him on the bus, which on June 30th, 1991, he met Matt Turner, actually in Chicago, at a bus station. Dahmer was attending a pride parade. That's when he met Matt Turner, then lured him back to his apartment. Matt Turner was black, but this guy's white, so they kind of swapped him. Both Pat and Jensen talking about the holes that they found and realizing there's more to the story, and learning about his human zombie or living zombie experiments. Pat going over, you know, the relationship that grew with Dahmer, kind of being the only guy that he could talk to, even talking about where these clothes came from, and how, actually, I don't want to give too much away, but how Pat gave him these clothes for court, and where they came from. Even Pat talking about eventually, you know, talking about how kind of pathetic Dahmer was, to the point where it almost made him feel sorry for him, then making himself feel sorry for feeling sorry. And then it goes into his personal aftermath, like with his marriage, how he had to move into like this Dahmer-like apartment by himself, and that kind of gave him a shocking parallel. Footage of Pat on the stand, Pamela talking, well, she also talked about how everyone slept like in the foyer of the building because they were all too scared to sleep alone, and then how everyone had to get rehoused and where they were going. Both talking about the celebrity that they experienced being part of the Dahmer story, and how they didn't quite enjoy it, or they thought it was strange. They do dramatize the hazmat removal towards the end. And then Pamela, where she was when she heard about Jeff's death. Pat, where he was when he heard about Jeff's death. And then there's some voiceover. I miss who said it. But this guy that does this experiment with talking to kids about, hey, would you wear this killer sweatshirt? What they say that, what if I told you it was Jeffrey Dahmer's? And then their reactions. And then with end text saying, you know, well, actually, we also get news footage of when they announced Jeff being found sane and, you know, being sentenced. But yeah, then it ends with text juxtaposed to footage of the Oxford apartments being torn down. um, where everyone is. How Jeff was killed 2 years into his sentence, where Jensen, Pat, and Pamela would all go on to do since the Dahmer story. And that's the documentary. I mean, it's only 76 minutes. It is short. It goes by very quick. It's a very fast-paced, it constantly it keeps itself moving. The only slow parts would be the dramatizations. But yeah, this is a very good, well-made, very intimate look at just the final chapter of Dahmer's life, the arrest, trial, and sentencing. Briefly talking about his death. You don't even get a lot of footage of Dahmer. This really is mostly just about the people that were involved. So that's another interesting aspect about it. But still, very well made. Definitely worth checking out. This is definitely one that stands out over, literally a ton of other documentaries on Dahmer. It's one I've always enjoyed. This is one where if I had nothing to watch and just need like a time killer, I always pop it in. And, it always goes by really fast. It's one of those documentaries where there's always something that you might forget, or even something that maybe you didn't hear the first time. So even though it's really short and very limited on its focus, topics, and people being interviewed, it's still full of information. So definitely worth checking out. I always really enjoyed it. Do yourself a favor, buy the DVD. Keep physical media alive. So I do have more films and documentaries to get to. I have more coming in as well. So stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.